Thank you for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Documents in Detail webinar for March 25th, 2020. The focus of today's program was the 1912 Progressive Party platform. We were joined today by Dr. John Moser of Ashland University, Dr. Chris Burkett of Ashland University, and Dr. David Alvis of Wofford College. You can look up more information about our other free webinars at teachingamericanhistory.org or tah.org/programs/webinars.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser, Professor of History and Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. Welcome to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically important documents. We encourage all joining us today to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. Within the next week, leave an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from our book, 50 Core American Documents. The editor of that volume, in fact, is with us here this evening. Those documents are also available at Ashbrook Center's extensive document database located at teachingamericanhistory.org. The subject of today's program is the 1912 platform of the Progressive Party. To help discuss it are Dr. David Alvis, Associate Professor of Political Science at Wofford College, and Dr. Chris Burkett, Associate Professor of Political Science at Ashland University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
The really odd thing is, of the two of you, it is my colleague here at Ashland. We live, I don't know, not very far apart, yet I have seen David Alvis more recently than
I'm practicing extreme social distancing with you, John. So
the last out-of-town trip I took, just as all this COVID-19 stuff was getting fired up, was to the gorgeous Wofford College. And
so gorgeous, but not populated.
Yes, right. So this is a fascinating document. Let me start, as I always do, by asking each of you to talk for a little bit about why this document is so important. We include it in the 50 core documents.
Well, David, I've taught the Progressive Era course with David in the MAG program, and I know he's much more thoughtful than I am. So I'm going to defer to David to start with, David, if you don't mind.
Well, first of all, I think the one thing that's really helpful about looking at the Progressive Party platform of 1912 is that it's just a nice compilation of all the major social reform issues of the time. So what you have in the Progressive Party in 1912 is you have the coming together of all these disparate reform movements. You've got the women's suffrage movement. You've got the regulatory reform movement in business. You've got the conservation movement. You've got your social gospel movement. So all of those groups, those independent groups that were pushing social reform in different areas, come together under the banner of the Progressive Party in 1912. And so they actually were very careful in how they put their platform together to incorporate and reconcile many of their differences and incorporate them all into this document. The other thing, too, is that this document is really in some ways more important than the Republican or Democratic platforms of 1912 because this platform was billed as a covenant with the people. That's the essence, or was the essence of the Progressive Party, is that everything is about the people and our commitment to the people. So this is the People's Party. And so therefore the platform had to be more than simply vague aspirations. It had to be a contract with the people. And those are exactly Roosevelt's words in describing it. It was a contract with the people, and he said that we should be obligated to deliver on these as anything that we would be obligated to deliver on under a contract by law.
Yeah, those are great points. I'll just add on top of what David started with here, in addition to the document reflects a pretty remarkable achievement in the sense that after progressivism, generally understood, had been a kind of intellectual movement for 20, 25 years. The document itself represents, as David pointed out, that finally some kind of political cohesion on the part of those who considered themselves progressives in a political sense, on the political level. Again, not to say that they all agreed on everything in the document. I don't think, but I also think the document's significant if I can frame it in a kind of historical context. Even though the progressives lost the election of 1912, and in a sense, this document is the high watermark of progressivism as a political movement, in a sense, because the progressives were not successful in this election. The document itself serves as a kind of manifesto for future progressive thinkers. In other words, the outcome of the election in 1912, I think, kind of relegates progressivism to well, I don't want to say relegates. It means that its status in terms of its influence is going to continue on an ideological level. We're not going to have a party of progressivism or a progressive party, but what that means is the ideas that are embodied in this document will be found within the existing political parties. And I think in that sense, think ahead about to the time when FDR comes along and tries to convert the Democratic Party to the party of liberalism. In a certain sense, this platform becomes a checklist of things by which we measure the success of progressivism as an ideology in this country. Again, not to say everything explicitly is part of that sort of manifesto or that checklist, but it does set goals and aspirations for future progressive-minded political leaders to try to accomplish. So,
well, that leads us naturally to our first question from Billy Gallagher. He wants to know to what extent that this could be this platform as a foreshadowing of the New Deal.
Well, go ahead, David, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a number of ways, I think you see the beginning of a programmatic liberalism here in this document, and very much, I think, foreshadows the kind of more program-oriented elements of the New Deal. So, for instance, you see here there's a proposal for old age pensions, right, as they refer to them back then. So, Social Security. And also, too, you see here the beginning of an expansive regulatory state. So you have the proposal for a regulatory commission on federal for trade, right? Essentially a federal trade commission, which I know emerges in its sort of infant form in the with Wilson, but really becomes in some ways the center of the regulatory state under the New Deal. You also, too, have the proposal for a regulatory commission dealing with investments that anticipates the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934. And then also, too, you have the sense here, right, that the courts are the problem throughout the document. And that becomes clearly a hallmark of FDR's presidency, the challenge to the courts and their conservative reading of the Constitution. So in many ways, I think you see the anticipation of the New Deal here in the progressive platform.
Great points, David. And this is a great question from Billy. And David, you pointed us to some of the things that are mentioned in the section of the document under social and industrial justice. And this is kind of what I was thinking of in terms of a kind of checklist as some of the more immediate goals of progressives generally at the time. And David, you pointed out that let's see, I'm trying to find it in the document. To protect, one of the things that they call for in this list of requirements for social and industrial justice is protection of home life against the hazards of sickness, irregular employment, and old age through the adoption of a system of social insurance. So obviously that's, as you pointed out, David, pointing to some unfinished business that I think FDR and his progressive/liberal advisors would like to see brought to fruition and completion. But the other sense in which I see foreshadowing of FDR is in the sense that they're both very, very focused on economic reform, in addition to sort of institutional political reforms. The real focus of a lot of early progressives and FDR is to create a more stable economic regulatory system. And that means finally, under FDR's watch, creating the administrative apparatus that earlier progressives probably knew was necessary, but couldn't quite, bring into existence. But the emphasis on economic matters is, I think, something very strikingly similar between what a lot of the earlier progressives were calling for and FDR was really focused on. Part of the reason I frame it that way is because in an undergrad course, we're just getting into the Great Society. And there's a certain critique from Great Society liberals. I know I'm skipping way ahead, John, here, 30 years, 40 years in the future. But there's a kind of critique from Great Society liberals that earlier liberalism, which I think includes progressivism, focused too much, almost too exclusively, on economic things and the regulation of business and industry and establishing fair wages and dealing with labor issues and things like that. And I think they're right about that in the sense that that really was the focus of both earlier progressives and FDR, and of a lot of those things throughout this Progressive Party platform of 1912.
That's an important point. That's an important point that Chris brings up, in the sense that the ambitions of the Progressive Party platform in 1912, they weren't to remake the economy, but rather to secure stability in the economy. So the thing is that TR and others are always looking for something in between socialism, but also unregulated capitalism. And
Right.
primarily, you notice what the things that they really focus on here are things that provide a sort of modest attempt to limit the worst that could happen to you during an economic downturn or during under the power of economic trust. So the primary focus here is economic stability. There are some social reforms, but primarily the focus is economic stability.
Mhm.
And that, later liberals in the 60s, right, really viewed that as a sort of bourgeois liberalism rather than a real transformation of society.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Isn't it the case that the progressives are, to an extent that 1960s and 70s era liberals would not have appreciated, were interested in duties more than rights?
Yeah, the major emphasis of the progressives is on civic responsibility and more democracy, right? But democracy understood as the collective capacity of the people who recognize mutual responsibilities and duties. And so they wanted to kind of get away from all that sort of individualistic rights talk in order to focus more on a sense of civic responsibility. Because from their point of view, the problems of the modern industrial age, these large corporations with their control over the market economy, I mean, the reason for that was unregulated individual rights. If we had a better sense of civic responsibility, we'd have a better community.
Yeah, that's really well put, David. And they're hardcore, by the way, these early progressives, almost universally. John and I have had this conversation about how hard it is to define exactly who a progressive is and what makes a progressive a progressive.
Mm-hmm.
And you ask any one of these major progressive thinkers, and they'll give you different answers to that question. But I think one thing they all have in common and are very, very serious about is the sense of a kind of absolute moral, almost categorical moral imperative to get people to behave in what they call a more ethical manner. It's that emphasis, David, you were just pointing out, right, about the emphasis on civic responsibility, and they're very hardcore moralists in the sense that they find actions that are egoistical, self-interested, selfish. They spend a lot of time in their writings and in their rhetoric condemning that kind of motive in human affairs, and especially in business and industry, right, as immoral. And I think part of their emphasis on civic responsibilities is because they truly believe that it's an imperative to transform the society, to convert our society into an ethical society, one in which the sort of selfish motives that manifest themselves in unregulated sort of laissez-faire economics, right? We need to find a way to deal with that, and finally say that we have a truly ethical society. That's a little more abstract part of their sort of their philosophy, but you do find manifestations of that even in the Progressive Party platform. I was looking at the section on business in particular, which begins, "We believe that true popular government, justice, and prosperity go hand in hand. And so believing, it is our purpose to secure that large measure of general prosperity, which is the fruit of legitimate and honest business, fostered by equal justice and by sound progressive laws." And the very next paragraph, "We demand that the test of true prosperity shall be the benefits conferred thereby on all the citizens, not confined to individuals or classes, and that the test of corporate efficiency shall be the ability better to serve the public, and that those who profit by control of business affairs shall justify that profit and that control by sharing with the public the fruits thereof." So that's a pretty strong, I think, critique of what you might consider the sort of traditional business motive, which was to make profits, right? And instead, progressives are calling for a more ethical way of conducting business, one in which business is conducted in a manner that both in its consequences and in its intentions is done for the sake of promoting the welfare of the whole society somehow.
Yeah, you can really see here where this section on business really is helpful too. I think Chris is right on this, that this section on business kind of helps to see how the progressives think. So those first two paragraphs, all the progressives could agree on. And as Chris was describing, the thing that all progressives agreed on was they always use this term to describe earlier thinking or early American political behavior, what they called a policy of drift, and that is,
Right.
government basically just let everyone do whatever they wanted to,
Yeah.
up until the point of the modern industrial revolution. And it was that policy of drift, right, that's really responsible for all these problems with economic concentrations of wealth and political corruption. So we've had up until this point a policy of drift. And what we need a definite program. We need some particular vision of of the future for American society, and the national government is going to have to be the central focus for promoting that. So the big problem with America has been its individualism, as Chris said, its egoism, and also too its practice of decentralized government. So what we
Right.
need is a strong central government with a clear policy. And you can see the influence of that on us today, right? We always say, right, you have to have a public policy, right? You need a policy, you need public
Right.
policy, right? I mean, prior to this, right, there wasn't a public policy, right? One didn't need a public policy. One needed an executive that would enforce law and a legislature that would draft laws for particular problems in particular situations. You didn't need a public policy. And the progressives really begin the process of begin the idea that government requires a public policy. So even their formula is kind of funny about the past. They call it a policy of drift. I mean, there was no policy before this, right? Progressives want to focus, everything has to involve a public policy. So if you didn't have a policy, well, then that was a policy too. So it's a policy of drift. I'll point out, though, one thing that's interesting in this section on business, right, that is very revealing about the progressive, about the concrete facts about the progressives, and that is, while all the progressives could agree on those first two paragraphs, the part that got more complicated were the next paragraphs. So the next two paragraphs recommend some vague notion of a regulatory body that will regulate corporate behavior. And at one point under the business section, they say, look, we have to live with the fact that large corporations are inevitable. And therefore, we need this regulatory commission of experts, economic experts, that can come up with policies and regulate business activity in the interests of the people as a whole. But then the last paragraph says, right, we need also a stronger Sherman antitrust law that will, essentially, right, restore competition and basically break up these large, powerful trusts. Well, the problem there is that you're promoting two different ideas, contradictory ideas at once. One is you're saying we should break up the trust. The other one says we should accept them as inevitable. And what you see here is actually the attempt to bring together in one section two completely contradictory strands of progressivism. So there were those progressives who wanted to break up the trust. There were those who said, no, you want to keep the large corporations and regulate them. And so what's interesting here is that last paragraph on the Sherman, on promoting a stronger Sherman antitrust law, that paragraph was actually removed in all official publications of the Progressive Party platform, because there was a major funder named George Perkins who opposed that, and but didn't find out until the next day that it got somehow into the platform. And so he said, well, I'm going to pull my money out of this campaign if that paragraph is there. So in all official publications, that paragraph was not included. But it shows you there was actually a lot of tension between the progressives about exactly what the business policy should be.
Yeah, those are great points.
So we've got some questions from our viewers. John Talley asks, on some level, doesn't this progressive program also look to the past and to Madison for government to look out for the rights of minorities?
Hey, John, great to hear from you. Yeah, that's a great question. It's in a certain sense, yeah. Yes, John. Progressives, for all their emphasis on civic responsibilities, also articulated an understanding of the importance of rights. But I would suggest that the way they thought about rights was very different from the Madisonian sense of rights. I mean, first and most immediately, and John, I know you're aware of this from our many conversations about such things. Madison's understanding of rights, even civil rights or rights of citizens, was grounded deeply in an understanding of natural rights. Progressives tended to view such a basis for an understanding of rights as outdated and hopelessly theoretical and false. But there's an interesting sense, excuse me, as you ask about the need for government to look out for the rights of minorities. interestingly enough, with progressives, they're not actually, David, correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, they're not really using the language of rights of minorities. The language they articulate, and especially Theodore Roosevelt, and it comes through in this document, is the rights of the majority, which is being violated by the minority in the as they embody themselves in, you know, owners of corporations and the sort of, relatively small number of extraordinarily rich people. So, excuse me, in an earlier campaign speech, Roosevelt had mentioned in the speech is titled "The Right of the People to Rule." He begins that speech by saying, I don't really give a darn for this concept of the rights of the minority, or I'm not concerned about majority faction. Is actually the way he phrases it. I'm concerned in this day and age, under our present economic circumstances, with minority faction, by which he means, again, this small number of unethical business owners, business leaders, violating the rights of the great majority, right? And what are those rights? Well, Roosevelt never quite, to my knowledge, explains those rights in the language of natural rights, but something more like what we eventually get from FDR: the rights of labor, the rights of a safe workplace, the right to rights of upward mobility and opportunity, and these sorts of things. So yeah, in a certain sense, John, I think your question is a great question. In a certain sense, I think you're right. On the surface, the language of rights is there, but in some ways, the exact inverse of the way Madison described these things.
David, you care to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think because Chris really nicely covers all the parameters of that debate. So there's I don't have a lot to add, but one way of thinking about it is this: in liberal democracy, you're always going to be trying to balance majority rule, right, with individual rights. And if you look at Madison's major concern is individual rights, because majorities just will always win numerically in a democracy. And so the major concern that you need to have, the emphasis, needs to be on how do you protect individual rights, and that's what the purpose of government should be. It's not that the progressives don't care about rights. They too also see government as a balance between majority and balancing majority rule and minority rights. But their argument is that the emphasis at this time needs to be more on majority rule and less on minority rights.
Yeah.
Because the minority that they're concerned about are these wealthy owners of capital industries who are protected in those capital industries by property rights. And so they believe, right, that the emphasis of their time needs to be on majority rule and not on minority rights. So Chris cited that very famous line from Roosevelt at the beginning of The Right of the People to Rule, where Roosevelt says, I have scant patience with this talk of majority tyranny, right? Because the problem we have today is the tyranny of minorities, not the tyranny of majorities. There's an interesting way, though, that issue becomes problematic at the Progressive Convention in Chicago in 1912, and that is the progressives, wanted to have a national movement. To have a national movement, you got to win votes in the South. And so when the South, right, shows up with their delegates, they actually, many Southerners insisted that their delegations were going to be all white with no participation by African Americans. But Northeastern liberal progressives felt that, you should extend progressivism to people of all races. And so there was a really intense confrontation. And ultimately, Roosevelt's solution was, well, what we need is African Americans from the Northeast that will be leaders, but in the South, we're going to have Southern whites take care of African Americans. And that was his middle ground solution, which really just turns a sort of deaf ear to this, probably one of the most serious issues of minority rights in that day.
It helps us to understand why Du Bois endorsed Wilson. As racist as Wilson was, Du Bois got his vote, or he got Du Bois's vote. Right. By the way, this leads me to mention an article that Roosevelt wrote. I think it may have been for the Atlantic, where he's talking about women. Now, in the course of this, he says, "Oh, I do support the vote for women." But it's in the context of it is, well, I don't like talking so much about rights as I like to talk about duties. And the duties of men and women are very different. He made it clear that he saw the duty of women as to reproduce and raise children and keep a household. Though he thought when it came to politics, they both should have should have an equal voice.
Yeah, it was an evolving position for him, right? So the originally, right, he was opposed to women's suffrage and argued, right, that women have a duty, and that duty is in the home, and should, that duty should come before any assertion of individualism. But then in the convention, I don't know if it was just political opportunism or if he actually became persuaded by Jane Addams and Florence Kelley, who were very active in the Progressive Party and at the convention in 1912. He became a stronger supporter of that, but he did try to reconcile his older view with his new view, and that was, yes, women's duty is in the home, but right, they should also too have political equality because of that duty. So he was at pains, I think, to try to reconcile those views.
Yeah, those are great points. I mean, can I, John? There's another question that's kind of related to this from Joshua,
right?
Who asked, "Why do you think that the progressive platform did not extend to all?" And he cites Native Americans and Black Americans, and I think the answer is similar to that of the question of why did Roosevelt not initially support women's suffrage and the expansion of rights for women? As David says, it's kind of an evolving view of Roosevelt's. But I think with Roosevelt, the answer to that is a combination of political calculation, but also deeply held, almost philosophical beliefs on the part of Roosevelt. Sorry if I said Wilson earlier. On the part of Roosevelt that were shared by many of his fellow progressive thinkers, and that's this sort of historical sense, in an odd kind of way, despite the seemingly radical nature of some of the institutional changes that the Progressive Party platform calls for, there's still a kind of conservatism in an odd way, although they wouldn't have called it that at the time, in Roosevelt's thinking about things. And that is, we're making progress, but we don't want to get ahead of ourselves in a certain sense. Women's rights, an expanded role for women in the public sphere may be on the future horizon, but we're not quite there yet, or we have other more pressing things to deal with. And I think that's also true with the case of Roosevelt and other progressives' views on Native Americans and Black Americans. Again, there's a wide range of views among progressives on these things. Some progressives were quite concerned with advancing rights of African Americans, Black Americans, and others saw that as an issue that would have to be dealt with in the future when circumstances were more favorable for such reforms. But I will say this on the part of Roosevelt, he did back away from his association with both Native Americans and Black Americans after some political backlash early in his presidency. After meeting with Booker T. Washington, there was some political backlash that was very unfavorable to Roosevelt, and he very quickly backed away from any kind of clear public position on Blacks and Native Americans as a result of these things. So,
It's also,
David.
It's also helpful to see kind of how progressives like Roosevelt think about questions like rights and particularly minority rights. And that is, Roosevelt, it's sort of well known that, he had a particular race theory that was not unique to him. I mean, many progressives held this racial theory that the Teutonic races were the superior races, and that they had a responsibility to cultivate other races and bring them up to a level of civilization that was equal to that of the Teutonic races. And in some ways that was their substitute for the notion of natural rights, right? Instead, there was this sort of evolution of human nature through history, and the Teutonic peoples were leading that. The thing is though, what that does is that what that kind of thinking does is it no longer makes it an imperative to immediately try to remedy injustices that are violations of rights, because you don't believe that human beings by nature have these rights. And so therefore you can always justify in your mind, by Roosevelt's theory, that you're going to put off um, problems, right, involving race, because that's just something that history will work out in the future. So, I mean, in some ways, right, that progressive thinking about human nature becomes an easy excuse for not immediately addressing what are clearly wrong.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say just quickly. I mean, again, it's a matter of it's a combination for a lot of progressives of the certain racial way of thinking, as David very nicely articulated, and also a matter of sort of historical priorities. I mean, at this time where progressives are really focusing on the economic rights and the economic welfare of the majority of American citizens who happen to be white, and they're focusing all of their efforts on that, and so the rights of racial minorities they're going to have to be kicked down the road. That can's got to be kicked down the road, and it's kicked a long way down the road, as we know. So.
Billy Gallagher asks, given that the document claims the Republicans are Judases and the Democrats are competent, who did the party draw from? From what region, what social class, political base?
It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we could look back and see some of the earlier, I think, inspiration for some of the issues progressives were dealing with from the populist movement. There are a number of similar goals between the Progressive Party platform of 1912 and the populist platform of 1896. So I think I don't want to oversimplify this, but the progressive movement is a kind of revived populist movement, but with a lot more particular ideas attached to it in a certain way. That's maybe an oversimplification of the thing. But look, progressives generally shared a certain understanding of history, and that meant a certain understanding of our own past. So it's true that the progressives are very critical of the both parties at the very beginning of this document, right? Political parties exist, it says, to secure responsible government and to execute the will of the people. From these great tasks, both of the old parties have turned aside. Instead of instruments to promote the general welfare, they have become the tools of corrupt interests, which use them impartially to serve their selfish purposes. But it ends this section, the Progressive Party platform ends in this section by saying that we're unhampered by tradition and uncorrupted by power, undismayed by the magnitude of the task. And therefore, the new party offers itself as the instrument of the people to sweep away old abuses and to build a new and nobler commonwealth. And I like that language because it really sort of captures this historical sense of progressives. That is, there's a real emphasis in a need to break in a very large degree from our political traditions, and that includes the political traditions that had embodied themselves in the Republican and Democratic parties. At the same time, you might notice, though, just before that in the preamble, they claim to be right in line with Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, right? So there's this interesting mixture when you ask to whom do the progressives look for inspiration, or at least in their rhetoric, uh, who do progressives turn to as their inspirations or their authorities? In one paragraph, they cite Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, and the very next section, they say, we're really not beholden in any way to the traditions of these parties. But now in other places, progressives will say something a little bit different. Not so much in this document, but it's kind of implied here a little bit. And other progressives will make the argument that we are in a way trying to restore the original intent or the original trajectory that the founders, including Thomas Jefferson, meant to place the country on, but that we've somehow gone astray and our politics have been corrupted as a result of industrialization and the growth of massive corporations and massive wealth in the hands of a few. So it's really hard, Billy, to pinpoint from any particular source that progressives draw their inspiration from. It's a little bit of lots of sources, but they have this kind of interesting love-hate relationship with the past. So Dave, maybe you could put this, I'm sure you can't put this more articulately than I am.
No, that's really,
or add your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, also too, you give a really nice articulation of kind of what the essence of the progressive intellectual thought is. I think the one thing you have to keep in mind, right, is that when it comes to the concept of progressivism, right, so everybody claimed to be a progressive at this time. So remember, Taft was a progressive. I mean, I know history hasn't treated him that way, but he was a progressive in the sense that he favored progressive reforms and and he did in fact advance a notion of regulating the trusts, right, either through trust busting, but he also favored federal regulations of trust. Roosevelt liked him for a reason, right? He was a progressive of sorts. Also, Wilson claims to be a progressive, and he was, a progressive intellectual. So, in some ways, a lot of people are progressives, right? But they belong to different parties: Democratic Party, Republican Party. So, what draws people to the progressive political party is a particularly interesting question, right?
Right.
Why the political party of the progressives, right, as opposed to the Democratic or Republican Party? And the big pitch of the Progressive Party, regardless of its language of, we're the party of the people, is that we're also the party of direct democracy. And we're not gonna allow, political bosses or even constitutional limitations to mediate those interests. But when you look at the Progressive Party makeup, right, what does that really amount to? That is this party of direct democracy. What kind of people really end up joining it? And I think what you find is the kind of people that end up in the party are basically special interest groups that have a particular issue, a particular agenda that they've been driving home. You have Jane Addams and the settlement movement. You've got business individuals in business like George Perkins and Frank Munsey and others, right, who have a particular vision of way business ought to be regulated. You've got your conservationists, right, who have a very specific vision of how natural resources should be used. So the people who join the party tend to be issue specific, and they believe that this is an opportunity to drive that issue home. And one other thing that's revealing about the kind of people that are in the Progressive Party is Chris mentioned that there's all these very sort of common folk references, right? Quotes, by Jefferson and by Lincoln. And there were all at the Progressive Convention. There were all these hymns, that would have, really been rousing to what you would refer to as the ordinary man. And so printed on the convention's pamphlet, on the front of it were quotes, about the common man from Jefferson and Lincoln. But on the back of the party convention of the party program for the convention was an advertisement from Chicago Business Real Estate, in which the motto was, "There is economic security in real estate." And so
That's great.
so then you suddenly have a sense of what kind of people were at the Progressive Party, and that was middle class, right? Middle or upper middle class reformers. That's your constituency.
This is, if I may indulge myself for a moment, this is what my impression of the progressives has always been. The Progressive Party is a party for people who hate political parties.
Yes.
Because they grew up with this party system, with all the rallies and the parades and a certain amount of corruption and political machines, and they said, this is messy. We don't like this. Who are we? We are white. We are middle class or upper middle class. We are professionals, and we are committed not to one party or to another, but to the public good, whatever that may be, and however we may define that. And so these are the people that really flock to the standard of the party, and that probably, I'm guessing that helps explain why the party didn't have real staying power. There was no mass base behind it, right? Workers did not flock to the Progressive
That's
Party.
a great point.
Did not flock to the Progressive Party. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Go ahead, David. Sorry.
Well, one thing I wanted to say about that is, so a lot of times, right, kind of these middle political movements, right, that have a special, that kind of have a very narrow focus, right? These, what you would today call special interest groups, right? They particularly see an opportunity in an organization that promotes something like direct democracy, because that's a way that you get your interests through without you having to negotiate a compromise with somebody else. And so the thing is that the old political parties, right, they forced people to compromise and to bargain and collect. And in interest groups, especially when they're driven by a sense of justice and reform, they don't want to compromise. And so, yeah, that does, I think, partly explain why this party didn't survive. But what you see is that in every way that we have reformed our political institutions to make them more plebiscitary or democratic in the way that the progressives wanted, we see now the proliferation of special interests, right? That are not interested in compromising, and don't want to and refuse to negotiate. So the more that we move towards things like direct primaries, the harder it is to get people to reconcile their differences and negotiate and find a compromise. So in some ways, we really live with today the legacy of these progressive reforms, and it turns out to be kind of a competition among various special interest groups that are not interested in finding much of a middle ground.
That's really, really thoughtful, David. I hadn't thought of it that way. I was just going to back up just a little bit and just add on one other point on to the points that you're both making about, the base, so to speak, of the Progressive Party. It again is relatively well educated, a lot of intellectuals, but mainly middle class. The common man, so to speak. Even though that language is there, David, as you mentioned earlier, the common man and appeal to rights and democracy and rule of the people, it's there. It's not. It doesn't grab enough people. I was going to throw in there the social gospel movement is another one of those groups, David, right? That has a particular interest in this, the outcome of this, and they're inclined. But the social gospel movement itself is largely a movement of intellectuals or relatively well-educated middle-class white Americans. But the third factor here, in just going off your last excellent point, David, is party loyalty, right? So there are some people who are attracted to the Progressive Party because they're fed up with the need to compromise in the traditional parties. But at the same time, a large number of Americans in the 1912 election uh, are just really party liners in a way. And at this point, how your grandfather voted was still really important to you. And families were Democratic or Republican. And it is interesting the extent to which the Progressive Party is able to break so many people away from voting Republican or Democrat. But in the election itself, uh, Roosevelt ended up with what did he end up with? 26% of the popular vote, or something to that
Yeah.
effect. Um, a lot of that may have been a personal like of Roosevelt, but not necessarily a personal agreement with the platform of the progressives. A lot of people were still in that mindset of, hey, my family's always been Democrat and I'm always going to vote Democrat, or we're a Republican family and we're going to vote Republican. So, again, that may help to explain anyway the reason why the progressives weren't able to build this base, which you think they would be able to build, of majority of laborers in the country, for example.
Well, and another big problem for the party is that one of the accusations against Roosevelt was that this party is just your personal, this is just your personal project, right? This is just, it's just an extension of your personality. It's a cult of personality. It's not really a political party, which is a devastating critique of the Progressive Party, because it's supposed to be the party of the people, not the party of, say, Theodore Roosevelt. And the thing is that the more you look at it, right, in its history, it really completely depended upon Roosevelt to hold the different groups together. Otherwise, there's no unifying bond. And so when he decides not to try again in 1916, the party falls apart. I mean, for the most part, it never becomes a serious party without him. So at the end of the day, you couldn't get away from the perception, right, that it's really just in some ways about TR.
Yeah, and that, by the way, Tiffany asked a question about TR deciding to run, mostly because he wasn't going to get the Republican Party nomination. There's a lot of truth to that, I think. But again, with Roosevelt, I want to say that a lot of this, a lot of the content in the party platform, he did sincerely believe in and hope to see come to fruition. But I think we have to be realistic and admit that Roosevelt was kind of fond of Roosevelt a little bit. And so, I mean, personalities are always an interesting factor in these things. And so, David, you mentioned the extent to which Roosevelt's personality was so important as the kind of glue, in a certain sense, right? And I think Roosevelt realized that, his own importance in that sense. So
we have a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to, but I do want to I want to ask this one from Kevin Loeb. If you had to envision the progressives winning in 1912 with the kind of majorities that Wilson had, what do you think they would have done to implement their platform? Let me put a little twist on that. Do you think they would have done differently than Wilson did?
David, you want to take a shot at this?
I think they would have tried to do exactly what Wilson did, but
Yeah.
not been able to create a coalition to get it done.
That's a great point. Yeah. So again, Wilson, he's the variable in all of this, right? The real factor. And I know we're familiar with the idea that the only reason Wilson won in 1912 was because Roosevelt split the Republican Party. And there's some degree of truth in that, but what that does is it undercuts Wilson's, I think, real political skill, running a good campaign and being able to build some sort of coalition among progressive-minded members of Congress in his first 2 years in office, anyway, right? Wilson's pretty successful in implementing his new freedom platform between 1912 and 1914. but he's got Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, of course. But he builds a coalition with progressive-minded Republicans, and he's actually getting a Democratic Party that is the party of anti-federal regulation, right? Historically, to move in that progressive direction as well. So I think Wilson's accomplishments between 1912 and 1914 are actually pretty impressive in his ability to bring about a lot of, but not all, but a lot of these progressive policies that are actually included in the progressive platform of 1912.
David.
Yeah, I think also too the other, I mean the other part of Theodore Roosevelt's vision was that the way to deal with the problems of politics is just move all policy making into the executive branch. And that way you can manage controversy much better than if you try to deal with issues with Congress. And the thing is that I think what probably TR didn't understand was that he was very successful in doing that as president, but because he had the support to some degree of the Republican Party to do it. Without that party, without that strong discipline within the party that's provided by that old boss system, if you don't have that, I think it becomes much harder for the president to be able to do those things. And
yeah. So when Roosevelt says, "Here's how we're going to deal with the tariff," I don't want Congress getting involved, because that's how there's all sorts of log rolling and right. All the different interest groups get their cut. We're going to have experts and an expert tariff commission set the tariffs, and presumably Congress will get to vote on it at some point, maybe.
That's a great example. The tariff is a great example. So there on the tariff issue, it's actually quite vague what he wants to do here on the tariff issue and the platform, and that is because there's a tension within the Progressive Party about what to do. One group wants to do a more of get rid of the tariff altogether. Roosevelt opposes that. You want to maintain the tariff, but on the other hand, you got to get rid of this Payne-Aldrich tariff, but you should do it slowly through executive policy, through an expert tariff commission. And so I think he thinks you can manage political crises that way. The problem is he can't even get his own special political party to fully support what he's doing. I mean, can you imagine if he tried to work with Republicans and Democrats and progressives on this? I think it would have been a disaster.
Yeah, those are great points. Hey, John, we only have a few minutes left.
Yeah. So
because I was, can I don't want to, sort of take us in the wrong direction here with so little time left, but there are a couple of questions about whether a viable progressive party could work today, or what would a progressive party look like today. And I find this question really interesting, and I'll just say sort of briefly here that in a sense there has been a resurgence, at least in a kind of attempt to revive progressivism in some of its earlier forms today. When I think about the election of 2008, I recall that, for example, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, when running for the nomination, dropped the language of liberalism and started adopting the language of progressivism, and even went so far as to describe themselves as progressives. And I think some post 2008 liberals actually think of themselves more as progressives, and what I mean by that is they are placing much more emphasis on, again, economic problems and the reform and regulation of economic things than putting the emphasis on social issues. Not to say those things aren't entirely important, but if you think about the presidency of Barack Obama, there was a lot of emphasis in his policies to deal with economic questions, and a lot of liberals were disappointed that he didn't become the sort of social issue warrior that they were hoping he would be. So in a certain sense, there has been a revival of progressivism, at least in the minds of some people. So it still has legs in a certain way, even if it's not a formal party.
David, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you also see it right in the primary contest for the Democratic Party right now, and that is that, I mean, I think in some ways Sanders hasn't been as successful in breaking new ground on a political ideology, precisely because people are more progressives than they are idiots. They don't like labels. They don't like doctrinaire approaches to politics. They like the progressive, pragmatic approach to politics. And so, in some ways, I think the legacy of progressivism is in this sort of pragmatic approach. We were always looking for something between unregulated markets and collectivism or socialism.
Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to make a plug. If you're interested in progressivism, this summer in our MAG program, I'm going to be teaching our Progressive Era course. The centerpiece of the course will be a role-playing game based on the election of 1912. You will be among the very first people in the world to play this game because I've been feverishly working on it in these weeks, and will be in the next.
That's awesome. Good luck with it, John.
I want to thank both of our panelists as well as the participants for their questions. As a reminder, you'll be receiving an email within the next week. That email will include a link for a certificate of participation. That email will also contain a link to the archived webinar, which we hope you will share widely with your colleagues and share it on social media as well. Help get the word out about what we do. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program, or one of our on-campus courses this summer. You can find more information about our online and regular course offerings, as well as scads of other resources for teachers, of course, at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will take place on Wednesday, April 22nd, when our topic will be Calvin Coolidge's speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Joining me at that time to discuss it will be Greg Schneider of Emporia State University and Robert McDonald of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So we look forward to seeing you back here on April 22nd. Until then, have a good evening, stay healthy, and let's get through this crisis.
Thanks for listening, and remember that our next Documents in Detail webinar will take place on April 22nd and will be about Calvin Coolidge's speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Before that, on Saturday, April 4th, we will have our next Saturday webinar on General Douglas MacArthur. Thanks again for listening.